People are extremely concerned these days with the issue of bullying. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about bullying and the problems associated with it. I think if we're serious about ridding the world of bullying, then we need to finally look at the biggest bullies in America, and those would be LGBT activists. They are the biggest bullies in America. In the latest act of viciousness and vengefulness, LGBT activists shut down an adoption agency. And this isn't even the first adoption agency they've gone after and shut down. This is just the latest in a series, because you really know that your cause is right and just and true if you're going after adoption agencies, right? That's a great indication that you're on the right side of things when that's what you're doing. Adoption agencies, bakeries, yes, these are the great villains that the LGBT folks are taking down. So they should applaud themselves. Pat yourselves on the back. You're real heroes. Anyway, Catholic Charities of Buffalo is just another adoption agency which was made to discontinue its adoption services because, if you can believe it, Catholic Charities of Buffalo is Catholic. They're also in Buffalo. So I don't know but it's the Catholic part of that was very upsetting to the LGBT mob, because the organization would not send children into households with same-sex parents, because Catholic Charities abides by Catholic teaching. Catholic teaching is that homosexual relationships are disordered, and further, children should have a mother and a father. That's not just Catholic teaching. That is the belief of anyone any Christian who takes the Bible seriously. So for that reason, it was forced to close down, or to close down its adoption facilities anyway. Now, here's the thing. The organization's original adoption policy was not only morally correct, but also scientifically and logically correct, although that's kind of beside the point. The fact that they're right about it almost doesn't matter when we look at this situation. But I still think we should stipulate that studies have shown children fare better in traditional mother-father families. Children in same-sex parented households, another study showed, have higher rates of depression, suicide, and abuse. But this should not be a surprise to anyone. This is self-evident. You shouldn't need a study to tell you. You shouldn't need to research it. You shouldn't need to read a book and say, well, let me do some research to find out if kids should have a mother and father. I need to do some more research into that. No, any rational person should realize this, because every child in history has had a mother and father. Every child who has ever existed, or will ever exist, or can ever exist, has had biologically a mother and father. No child can come into existence without one. Now, this would seem very strongly to indicate that every child should have a mother and father. The fact that every child does biologically would seem to suggest that nature intends for every child to have a mother and father. In the same way, we can say that every person should have two arms. And we can arrive at that conclusion based on the fact that every person who has ever existed has had two arms, unless something went wrong. If somebody is born with only one arm or no arms, then we know that there's been a deformity or a mutation or a disease. We know something went wrong. And we know something went wrong because we know that people should have two arms. And we know that people should have two arms because that's how people are. That's part of what it means. That's part of the human physical identity, is to have two arms. If you don't have two arms, then something went wrong, right? Same thing with the fact that kids have two parents. That's every person in principle. Every person has two parents. Biologically, every person has two parents. If a child is raised without their parents, or with only one parent, well, then that means something went wrong. Things didn't go according to plan somewhere along the line, if a person ends up without both of their biological parents. If something is, in principle, essential, natural, and necessary to the human identity, then logically we must say that it is how things ought to be and ought to be maintained. It is, in other words, again, natural. That is what's most natural. And if you're an adoption agency, of course, you're going to look to put kids into the most natural and ideal circumstances possible. This should be non-controversial. Obviously, if you've got a child needs to be adopted, you're going to look for a mother and father for the child. But as I said, the rightness of Catholic Charities' position here is beside the point. The real point is that they have the constitutional right to operate according to the teachings of the church whose name is plastered in huge letters on the building. They have every right to operate that way. They are the ones who have a right claim. They have a claim to rights here, the right to operate according to their faith. What claim do the LGBT activists have? The ones who are shutting down an adoption agency, on what basis do they wage that campaign? It seems like there can only be two ways to justify it. The first one is they could claim, and they have claimed, that they're forcing these adoption agencies to let gays adopt kids or else shut down because they're worried about the kids. And what they say is, well, if the kids aren't, if gay couples aren't able to adopt, then kids will be left unadopted. But that's clearly ridiculous. Just because a particular child isn't adopted by homosexuals doesn't mean that he won't be adopted by anyone. This is the false choice that you hear the gay activists make all the time. They say, well, what? So you're saying it's better for a child to be left languishing in the adoption agency than to be adopted by a gay couple? That's not the choice. There's a third option. The third option is that they're adopted by a heterosexual couple. And there's a line 50 miles long of heterosexual couples waiting to adopt. So by no means can you argue that the lack of gay adoption will necessitate that children will be left abandoned in the system, because there are many heterosexual families, mother-father natural families, that are waiting to adopt and that can adopt. And so if a child is not adopted by a gay couple, he is still could very likely be adopted by a heterosexual couple. This, by the way, is you hear the same kind of argument when it comes to adoption. You hear the same kind of argument from pro-aborts, where they will say, well, if you're so against abortion, then why aren't people lining up around the block to adopt kids? They are, you nincompoops. That's exactly what they're doing. There are tons and thousands of pro-life families that are desperately want to adopt and have been wading through the system trying to adopt and waiting to adopt. So that argument is just not true. And besides which, if you were really concerned about kids being, about kids getting adopted, then clearly it makes no sense to shut down adoption agencies. Even if a small minority of children have been left in the system because they weren't adopted by a gay family, which isn't happening, but even if it were, many, many, many more will now be left in the system because you're shutting down adoption agencies. So if this was really about the kids, you wouldn't be doing that. The LGBT activists, if they really cared about the kids, which they don't, but if they did, they would say, well, look, Catholic Charities, I disagree with their policy. It's very mean. It hurts my feelings. However, obviously, they should be able to stay open and do what they do because they're doing a wonderful thing. And they're making sure that kids get adopted. And so let's leave them alone. That's how they, if LGBT activists, if they gave a damn about kids or about anyone other than themselves, that's how they would approach these situations. They would make their case, they would make their argument, they'd make it passionately. And then when they're told by the other party concerned that, listen, I hear your argument, don't agree with it. These are my convictions. This is my organization. This is how I'm running it. So I'm not going to do what you want me to do. At that point, if the LGBT activists, if they cared about kids, they would say, okay, all right. Well, then we'll find an adoption agency that will adopt, that will let gay couples adopt. So this isn't about children. No, it's about the homosexuals themselves, as always. Everything on the left, it's always just about anytime a leftist is arguing about all their cause is everything, it's all about them. It's about their own advantage, their own priorities, their own benefit, their own gain. That's always what it's about. Now, you notice when you go over to the other side of the spectrum, and I'll be the last person to issue a blanket defense of all conservatives or to claim that they're all, virtuous and selfless and everything like that, because that's certainly not the case. But on the conservative side of the spectrum, some of the movements traditionally associated with conservatism, like the pro-life movement, these are selfless movements. Like a pro-life woman does not gain anything materially from being pro-life. She doesn't stand to gain anything from that. That's not a selfish position. It's an inherently selfless position, because she's arguing on behalf of children. And not only that, but she doesn't, it means if she gets her way and abortion is made illegal and then she gets pregnant, that option won't be open to her either. So that's a sacrifice she's willing to make. But you notice on the left, there are no sacrifices. They never make any, it's never about anyone else. It's never any sacrifices being made. It's always me, 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 me. This is what I want. But what they will try to do, and what the LGBT activists here have also done, on top of saying, oh, we care about the kids, they don't. But they also, well, it's about rights. This is a fight for rights. Well, what right was being violated? If a gay couple is told that they can't adopt, what right was violated? The right to adopt? That right doesn't exist. Children aren't commodities that you're entitled to possess. You don't have a right to a child in an adoption agency. That's a human being. It's not a thing you can own. What kind of person walks into an adoption agency and says, I have a right to one of these. One of these are mine. I have a right to them. What kind of arrogance is that? I mean, it's disgusting. I don't know how else to put it. They're not things. They're people. And you don't have a right to them. The only children you have a right to, if we want to put it that way, are your own children. So if you conceive or give birth to a child, you have a right to that child, as in that is your child. And no one has a right to take him from you unless the law has to step in because you are victimizing your child in some horrible way. Or if you do actually adopt a child, parents that do actually adopt a child, well, that's their child in every sense of the word now. That is their child. And no one has a right to take that child from them. But the children who are not adopted, who are in adoption agencies, and you're going and you walk into an adoption agency, none of those children are yours yet. So you don't have a right to them. You have no legal claim over them whatsoever. And besides which, there are many rules governing who can adopt. If we have a right to adopt, then that means that any old person should be able to stroll into an orphanage and adopt whatever kid they want with no qualifications. But that's not how it works, and that's not how it should work. Talk to any couple that's been through the adoption process. They'll tell you there are tons of hoops that you have to jump through. Probably too many hoops, but I think we all agree that there should be some hoops. I mean, there should be some qualifications. And so it's got nothing to do with rights. It's got nothing to do with the kids. It's just about being bullies. And this is just another in a long, long line of examples of the gay left scorching the earth, wrecking lives in an effort to impose its ideology on everyone. Jack Phillips is another, of course, example. You won a victory against them in the Supreme Court, but they haven't relented. They're still going after him. They're still trying to destroy his livelihood. And they'll continue the assault for another 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. Until they get their way. And we're seeing this repeated across the country with other bakers and photographers and people in the wedding industry and so forth. It's being demanded of all of them that they bow before the LGBT altar or they go out of business. Those are the choices they're being given. Speaking of bowing before the altar, just this week, Brown University pulled down a study which indicated that teenagers become trans to imitate their peers. The reason why this study was conducted is because if you look around and you see there's this massive uptick in people identifying as trans, which doesn't make any sense. If transgenderism is an actual natural biological phenomenon, There's no reason why there should be more of it now just because it's in the news. So it really seems like, kids are seeing how this gender fluidity stuff is in the news and it's in the media, it's in Hollywood. And so they're looking at, and their friends are doing it too. And so they're looking at that and they're saying, well, I guess I'm transgender also. It's because of peer pressure and because of, it's a trend, basically. Well, a study was conducted, which lent some credence to that view. But the LGBT mob reacted with outrage at this study, and they demanded that its contents be suppressed. They simply will not allow any discussion of the social and biological facts related to the trans thing. They will tolerate only a complete and unthinking acceptance of their dogmas, and that's what makes them bullies. By the way, keep this in mind. Keep it in mind how the LGBT folks suppressed a scientific study because they didn't like the conclusion. Not because they had any problem with the methodology, not because they could scientifically disprove it, but they just didn't like the conclusion, so they insisted that it be suppressed. Remember this the next time the left demands that you produce a study to prove some self-evident point that you've made. Well, if you have trouble locating studies like that, this is why. Because they won't tolerate studies that contradict them. They'll punish anyone who conducts them, and they'll throw them out. So, and then they demand that we produce studies to prove our points after they've thrown out all of those studies, and they've burned them in the bonfire, and they've threatened any researchers who might try to repeat the sin. The same thing happened with the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. LGBT activists insisted that transgenderism, which up until a few years ago was considered a mental disorder, they insisted that it be removed from the DSM. Again, not because there had been any scientific breakthrough, not because it had been proven that, actually, a man with a penis can be a woman. No, that never happened. They just didn't like it being in there because it offended them, and it wasn't ideologically convenient. And so for those ideological and political reasons, they demanded that it be removed. And they got their way, as usual. But now they'll actually try to use that to prove their case. So if you say transgenderism is a mental disorder, which it is, they'll say, oh yeah, well, it's not in the DSM. Yeah, it's not in the DSM because you had it removed. You demanded they take it out. You kicked and screamed and stomped your feet until it was taken out. That's why it's not in there, as you well know. Now, I could cite 1,000 other examples, but there's no need. The point is plain enough. LGBT activists are the worst bullies in America. By far, it's not close. They believe that their goal is manifestly good, and so they can resort to whatever means are necessary to achieve it. And if that means ruining lives, tearing down businesses, leaving children without families, well, as far as they're concerned, that is a price worth paying. Not even really a price, more like a perk because they enjoy it. I mean, they were celebrating when an adoption agency was closed down. They were celebrating it. They loved it because that's how bullies are. They just want to get their way, and that's how they get their kicks that way. And what is this good goal anyway? This good that they're working towards? Well, they'll say that they seek equality, but that can't be it because they already have equality. Homosexuals have all the same rights as heterosexuals. In fact, they have rights that heterosexuals don't have. For instance, I can't, if someone refuses to make me a cake, I can't go to the Human Rights Commission and complain about it and have anything done. They'll just laugh me out of the room. But if you're a homosexual, you actually have a right, supposedly, in some states, in many states, you have a right to cake. That's a right I don't have. In fact, the one and only inequality that was left between homosexuals and heterosexuals, the inequality was the rule prohibiting active homosexuals from donating blood due to the fact that homosexuals have a much, 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 much higher probability of contracting HIV than a heterosexual non-drug user. The rates of HIV in the gay community are much, much, much higher than they are in the among heterosexuals. And so for that reason, logically, if in the name of safety, gay people were not able to give blood. But even that is now under attack, and those rules are being repealed everywhere. The LGBT lobby will risk giving HIV to hospital patients if it means they get their way. They will shut down adoption agencies. They will risk giving HIV. They will tear down businesses, ruin lives, take people's livelihoods from them. That's what they'll do. And it has nothing to do with equality. So if equality isn't the aim, then what is the aim? Tolerance? They want tolerance? Well, homosexuality is not only tolerated, but celebrated. There's not going to be any parades marching down the street celebrating my sexual proclivities. No, that's only what homosexuals have. So they have much more than tolerance. They have, in many quarters, something much closer to worship, which is what they demand. So what is the point? It's not tolerance, not equality. Well, the point is just vengeance, spite, imposing their will, expressing their hatred, getting their way, power. They are bullies. And that's all the gay rights fight in America is anymore, because they have all the rights. And so now, anytime someone says they're fighting for gay rights, that's not what they're fighting for. They're fighting to impose themselves now. That's all it is. Thanks for watching, everybody. Thanks for listening. Godspeed.